For those of you who don't know, I work in a music shop. And one of my main jobs here is to service and set up guitars of all kinds, electric, acoustic, classical. One of the questions that gets asked quite a lot, almost every day, is what is intonation and why should I as a guitarist even care? That is the purpose of this video. I'm going to explain exactly how intonation works start to finish. We're going to go through the mechanical side of things, the mathematical side of things. The only thing we're not going to discuss is how to actually set intonation. That's for a different video. For now, I just want to look at the fundamentals. So let's grab one of these guitars and look into it. Before we get into intonation, we must first understand tuning. So you take a string and you stretch it across 2 points. In the case of a guitar, a nut and a saddle. Now this is broken up into 6 saddles because there's 6 strings and it is an electric guitar, but forget about that for the moment. You have a saddle and a nut, and the length that this is stretched across gives us the note. Alright, we'll get into tuning in a second. Just bear in mind, keep in mind for now, your nuts and your saddle create a very specific length that give us a note. Now, because we want some flexibility in our playing, because we understand that strings over time stretch, we give ourselves the ability to tune using tuning pegs. This is what gives us our tension. By the way, you'll notice the nuts and the saddles are pretty much the same distance and not exactly. That's where your intonation comes in. We'll talk about that in a minute. If you were to tune all of these strings to the same tension, if there was some kind of gauge that I could put onto these tuning pegs to guarantee that we're putting the same pressure, you'd have the same notes across all 6 strings. Now, obviously, you couldn't do that because the string is very thin. Tune it too much, it'll snap. You just will never get this thick string to sound as high-pitched as this string. The point I'm trying to make is this. It is the length that matters, not the gauge of the string. The gauge of the string affects tone. It also affects strength, but it affects tone. Having understood that about the length, the question becomes, how do we work out intonation? Well, to understand that, the next step we need to understand is the frets and why they are spaced out in the way that they are spaced. You'll notice that they start quite wide and then they get more and more narrow as we get closer to our saddles. Somebody, in fact we actually know who that somebody is, Pythagoras in ancient Greek, took what is called a monochord, which was literally just this one string across 2 bridges, and he began to fret. Pythagoras found that if you find the halfway point between your nuts and your bridge, or in his case 2 bridges, that's the halfway point there, you double the frequency. If you double the frequency, you double the pitch. That's why that sounds like that, and that sounds like that. It's an octave up because we doubled the frequency. In this case, it's an octave up because the length between nuts and bridge is long enough to give us 2 octaves. We'll get into that in a minute as well. But the thing to understand is that by halving the string and plucking at the same pressure, the string is vibrating twice as fast. He found that if you then halve between here and your bridge, which is now that fret, we halve the frequency because we've lengthened the string some more. If I had gone that way, we would have doubled it, but we're halving it to a 5th. And if you find the halfway points again, you get that fret, which is a 3rd. And if you halve it one more time, you get that fret. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how we measure out frets. It's just a matter of halving total lengths. That's the basic concept. Now you might say, well, hang on a minute, there's a whole lot of missing gaps here though. I mean, when we halved, now we didn't put in any of those frets. And when we halved again, we skipped out all of those frets. And when we halved again, we skipped out that fret. How do we get those measurements? Well, as it turns out, somebody, I have no idea who, did the maths. They actually calculated. They came up with an equation, an algorithm which we use to calculate the distance between frets. That, as your number, 17.817154, is the number that they came up with. So you take the length between bridge and nut, and you divide that length by 17.817154. And you get where that fret should be positioned there. You then take that length and you divide it by the same number and you get where that fret should be, and so on and so forth. You might notice that this is a very precise thing, right? These frets are extremely precise. In fact, it's so precise, it's down to 1/1000th of an inch. The fret distance is very important here. This is why we have intonation, the ability to adjust. Now, the way that guitars are set up, the length between nut and bridge gives us 2 octaves. This is why when we set intonation, we use the 12th fret, because it gives us 1 octave. Makes it nice and easy, or relatively easy, to hear if something sounds off. Actually, anybody with their salts wouldn't rely on their ears. They would use a tuner similar to this one, very precise. That's how you get your tuning to make sure that's correct. But here's the key thing. It all depends on the length of the string. What if we move this bridge back a bit? Well, all of a sudden, this fret is no longer the halfway point. We've moved the halfway point. You get what I'm saying? In fact, before we carry on, a quick side point to make is that when I fret here, the note is not being played where my finger is. It's being played on the metal fret. One way to think of it is that essentially when I fret there, this fret is now playing the same role that my nut was playing. Right? That's a good way to think of it. Which means that if I move this up, the tuning goes out. This E no longer sounds like E. Alright? You can tune this to sound perfectly regardless of how far this has moved back and forth. Remember, you've got a bit of movement here. You could move this thing probably that far and it will still sound perfectly in tune if you tuned it correctly. The issue is the halfway point has moved. Where all the frets should be lined up has moved. So when you play an open string, it'll sound fine. When you play an F, it might even sound good, fine. But as you get closer to the bridge, it will start to sound more and more out. If you've ever played like an E chord here and then a power chord and the power chord sounds out of tune, intonation is out. One or more of these strings isn't set correctly. But again, it's the length of the string that matters, and the reason that's the case on the guitar is because these frets are not adjustable. But we can adjust the length of the string. And you do that by adjusting this little screw. The way I like to think of it is, let's say I plucked, and let's suppose that this note sounded flat. That means we need to sharpen that note. How do we sharpen? We move up. To increase the pitch, we need to shorten the string. That's just logical. You'll see my fingers literally making the string shorter as I move up. So in order to do that, we need to loosen this, moving this saddle here closer to this nut, so the string gets shorter. But let's suppose I play this and it sounds a little sharp. So we need to flatten it. We need to make the pitch lower. In other words, we have to lengthen the string, which means we have to tighten, pulling the saddle away from the nut, making for a longer string. And that is how intonation works. I hope this video has been helpful to you, and I'll see you in the next one.